Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to Online Church. I am Pastor Jon Klaus of the Drakesville United Methodist Church. And again, this morning I want to extend a special thank you to Gail and Don Walton, who are helping quite a bit with uploading the sermon and giving us this chance to do this digitally online. So I want to open, like I always do, with the prayer requests and concerns that I received this week. And I wanted to let people know continued health and recovery thoughts, prayers, and wishes for Eileen Bolin. She is actually back home right now and doing well. Also, Kathy Moore's two sisters, Leona and Rachel, continued thoughts and prayers for their health and well-being. Prayers for Skip Johnson. He is back home and doing very well. His wife Dee is tending to his recovery, and he's looking good. Prayers also, of course, for the community, the county, and the country. God's provision, comfort, peace, and love. So I want to welcome folks again today. The title of our lesson is called Coming Home. And as many of you know, it is Palm Sunday today. And it's a time to celebrate when Jesus came to Jerusalem in order to celebrate a large religious festival with people there. Now, prior to that, he had been traveling the countryside with his followers, performing miracles and speaking to different groups of people. And I imagine that the decision to finally enter the holy city probably generated a great deal of excitement, not only from the people traveling with Jesus, but also to those who welcomed him with palm branches once they arrived in the city, like some type of glorious welcome home parade. I can just picture it. So it makes me think of a particular story years ago where my family and I were out traveling the country, as we often do during the summer months. And it's easy to take traveling for granted, isn't it? There was no fear of widespread pandemic back then. You could go state to state, cross county line, no big deal. And so our vacation was to the East Coast that year, and it was superb. It had all the bells and whistles a person could ask for. My wife, Shannon, did a great job planning everything. She had an Excel spreadsheet that listed each day's activities. And we had decided to travel by car across country to Virginia and Washington, D.C. The scenery, breathtaking, as we traveled through the Appalachian mountain range. Now, friends, God knew what he was doing with the American countryside and landscape in this part of the country. I suddenly felt very grateful to be alive. In fact, I remember one day where we followed a looming thunderstorm in its early stages of development as we drove down the highway to our first hotel. And the reflection of the setting sun against the tall, billowing storm cloud was like something out of a National Geographic magazine. It was exquisite. And our stay in Virginia was also picturesque, only an hour away from the ocean and boardwalk by car, not to mention some plush accommodations in the resort itself. Now from there we turned the car toward the nation's capital. The whole family's excited. There were monuments to visit, photos to take. And once we arrived at the hotel in downtown D.C., it was time to get unloaded and checked in. And up until that point, things had gone very well. Probably a little too well. So it was time for a juicy vacation story, one of those Chevy Chase moments from National Lampoon's vacation movies. You see, when you travel to a large metropolitan city from rural Iowa, you kind of forget that buildings are often constructed in a way that focus on conserving space. We had exchanged the solace of wide open spaces for the concrete jungle. And from this point forward, I would become intimately acquainted with the hotel's underground parking garage. I think, in fact, I've told this story in the past before, once or twice. From the moment the gate went up and I pulled the car in, stress and claustrophobia took over. There was barely enough room to maneuver my mid-size SUV around the corners of the parking garage, much less into a parking spot. It was difficult to breathe. The painted lines were practically stacked on top of each other, or so it seemed. Most of the signs read compact vehicles only. Oh, to be driving a Volkswagen Beetle back then. Things became worse as I met another vehicle attempting to exit the garage. The driver had the same panicked look on her face as I did. Lucky people, I thought to myself, they were allowed to leave this place. I estimated maybe 2 or 3 inches between our cars as we glided past each other, too afraid to make eye contact. And then soon after, the sound of people arguing, followed by a loud crunching noise that rang out from the other bay. No doubt one of the other vehicles over there didn't quite make it around the bend as safely as I did. Did I mention it was hard to breathe down there? Well, the pinnacle of anxiety came when I finally gave up and I tried to exit the garage, only to find out there was no way out. You heard me correctly. At the very end of the ramp was simply a brick wall. In order to leave, you had to turn your vehicle around completely or go in reverse around the bends. I tried to do this twice, but the car was simply too large. I had to admit defeat, and I eventually pulled over into a corner. I can't remember the last time I felt so out of place. There were literally no spots big enough for my car, or so I thought. There was no recourse available. Now, I think many of us have a story like this from our past, don't we? One that we can whip out at a party or some similar gathering of friends and family. One of those you should have been there type of stories that becomes more and more embellished upon each retelling, like a good fishing story where each time you tell it, the fish gets bigger and bigger, except this time in my story, parking spots get smaller and smaller each time I tell it. But the feeling stuck with me even after my family and I returned home to Iowa, that feeling that something isn't quite right. I don't belong here, no safe place. Famous author and philosopher C.S. Lewis wrote often about the notion that the physical world points to the more celestial plane of existence. If we are hungry, there is food to eat. If we are tired, there is sleep to renew us. So in this particular case, Lewis may well have argued that if people don't feel like the world they inhabit is quite right, it may be because we aren't home yet. Not our real home, at least, not heaven. Our hearts give an inner testimony to the fact that there is something greater beyond this current existence. A place where the thin, painted yellow lines of a parking garage don't overlap to the spot next to it. A place where we finally feel like we will belong. An ultimate safe place to come home to. No looming viruses, no sickness, no suffering, no tears. I remember vividly a job interview I once had years ago with a large factory. I was applying for the job of on-site technical trainer, and the human resources person was very excited to have me that day. In my life, in the past, I've done a lot of teaching and training and documentation. So from the moment I entered the building, however, I knew it was a bad fit. They were interested in hiring someone who could drive a forklift and wear a hard hat. Instead, I write articles and preach sermons. And I remember being taken on a tour of the plant that ended very abruptly once they realized I was not wearing steel-toed boots. I wasn't allowed beyond a certain area without them. The supervisor used to refer to his female employees as honey. I was out of place and we all knew it. There was something not quite right. That feeling of being displaced began to surface once again. Job interviews, parking garages, that's one thing, but what happens when these feelings give rise to something a little more serious? What happens when people allow that feeling of being lost to turn into feelings of hopelessness and despair? Easy to do, I suspect. In photographs, for example, everyone looks happy all the time, right? They show photos of vacations and grandkids and new cars and big houses. Everyone's smiling and hugging. Birthday parties, Christmas gatherings around the fireplace. Everyone's happy. But only occasionally does real life sneak in, and someone will post something about a tragic event or maybe an addiction they are struggling with. And I believe this can affect churches also. People who are hurting and feeling lost may show up seeking after something, only to look around and see the Sunday morning show, well-dressed, upper-middle-class people singing and smiling. No one here is struggling the way I am, they might think to themselves. After the third or fourth song about God's glory, the same person may feel like turning around and heading for the door. They don't fit in. Something isn't quite right. They thought church would be different. They had hoped people would show their brokenness a little more openly. They're worried that they don't fit in. So what does God say about preparing a place for you and I in this uncertain world? John 14, verses 1 to 4 says this, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God, trust also in me. In my Father's house there are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. I am going there to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you with me, that you also may be where I am. You know the way to the place where I'm going." Beautiful words, and the world needs to hear them, especially now. Not only does Jesus tell us that he has a place for us, but he has also provided a roadmap how to get there. It is the gift of salvation offered freely to anyone who wants it. An important stop marked on this roadmap occurs in the book of Romans. Chapter 10, verse 9 says that if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. What a blessing, folks. We live in a world where we can feel things aren't quite right, can't we? We often feel out of place, alone, hopeless, especially right now. The Bible identifies this, and God provides an answer to it. Something you and I can cling to in times of difficulty. God's offer stands to anyone who seeks after him with all their heart, mind, and soul. A mansion with many rooms awaits those believers who take seriously God's roadmap and who listen to the command in the book of Romans. Friends, no one stays lost in the parking garage unless they want to. It's better to follow the roadmap. Well, after my failed attempt to park my vehicle under the hotel in Washington, D.C. that day, I had decided to walk back up the ramp to the lobby and ask for assistance at the front desk. I am perfectly aware that men don't ask for directions while driving. I get that. But this situation was extreme. I had to swallow my pride and be humble. The gentleman behind the counter had obviously heard this problem before. He was nice enough to leave his post for a moment and accompany me down to the coffin-like expanse of the garage. It took about 20 minutes of him directing me as I backed the car into a tiny spot. I managed to squeeze into an area next to one of those support beams that looked just big enough for a skateboard. We even had to fold my rear view mirrors inward in order to fit. To this day, I can't remember how I got out of the car. So it appeared that asking for help and having a little faith was exactly what the doctor ordered. And I think that this same prescription applies to the world we live in as well. We need never feel alone or helpless. Now, according to the official website for Anxiety and Depression of America, the ADAA, anxiety disorders are the most common mental illness in the United States. And this was before the virus pandemic. Only 36% received professional treatment. General anxiety disorder affects 6.8 million adults. Social anxiety disorder affects 6 million adults. And the psychological effects of COVID-19 are yet to be measured. To me, this speaks to an entire segment of the population who might be feeling literally isolated and figuratively alone, out of place, like they don't belong. Even more so now during the climate of fear that we live in. Some of you might know the story of Aaron Stark. Okay, Aaron Stark went on a TED Talk. If you don't know what a TED Talk is, they're really interesting. You can Google it, go on YouTube, type in Aaron Stark TED Talk. And what they do in a TED Talk is they get up and they talk about different areas of expertise that they have. So the title of Aaron Stark's TED Talk was "I Almost Became a School Shooter." Quite the title. So Aaron talks about his life, what it was like to be a child, what it was like to grow up and be a teenager. No father. His mother was a drug addict. would often be high or drunk. And so they moved around from town to town because his mother would continuously get in trouble with the law. So they were on the run. Aaron never had the right clothes, never the right shoes. Sometimes he could get a shower in, sometimes not. He would change schools every few months. He was always the new kid. Now the popular folks, the bullies, centered on him all the time, every time he switched schools. As he became a teenager and later in life, he attempted to take his own life. By grace of God, he wasn't successful. He ended up in the hospital room recovering. He says when his mother came to pick him up, all she said to him was, "Next time, do it right." The poor man. Aaron tells the story of being completely hopeless, out of place, feeling like he didn't fit in. But by grace of God, one person in his life believed in him. One person is all it took. And as he got up and stood up in front of those folks during the TED Talk, he was married with children and happy for the first time in his life. He felt like he had a home. God cared about him, loved him anyway. One person makes a difference. There are people in our church that can make a difference, willing to help, willing to listen. There's a God who loves us and who has prepared a place for us in heaven. A place to call home where we will finally feel a sense of eternal belonging. A place where we can finally find our way out of the parking garage. A place where we can wake up and the nightmare is over. A type of place that Jesus rode into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey 2,000 years ago in order to create for us. A mansion with many rooms. If it weren't so, he would have told us. Will you pray with me? Gracious Lord, we know you have a place for us. We know from the Bible it's good, it's joyful, and it's open to everyone who follows the roadmap and calls on your name. This world is only our temporary home, Lord, and we know that. And as we kick off Holy Week this week, we remember the sacrifice you made for us on the cross. And we pray these things in Jesus' precious name.